Hello and welcome to tonight's event, Scottish Media for Everyone, ? Jointly organised by the Media Reform Coalition and Pass the Mic. I'm Debs Grayson, I'm your chair today, and I'm the coordinator for a campaign called the BBC and Beyond, Reimagining Public Media. This is a new campaign from the Media Reform Coalition to try and reimagine what public media could or should be in the digital age. Tonight's event is one of a series which will be feeding into a manifesto for a people's media we'll be writing later this year. We have another event coming up on Thursday looking at public media in Wales. This will be run as a Zoom seminar, so if you're interested, then please register using the links on Media Reform Coalition's social media channels. And then on July 14th, we'll be streaming another event, Can Public Media Be Anti-Racist? Again, details will be on our website and social media. Recordings of previous events are all available on the MRC YouTube. I'm just going to open by saying a bit about the BBC and Beyond campaign. This is a campaign about public media. What we mean by public media are media institutions that act in the public interest rather than the interests of politicians or wealthy owners. In some ways, it's an aspiration. We think that public media should be independent, able to hold powerful interests to account. They should be accountable, facing consequences when they do harm. They should be democratic, participatory, and representative of diverse lives. And they should be for everyone, serving everybody's needs and accessible to all. We all know that most of the media we have today are very far from this ideal. In theory, these principles of independence, accountability, and universality underpin our public broadcasters, the BBC and Channel 4. I'm sure part of the discussion today will cover how well we think they live these out in practice in Scotland and how they could be changed to do better. But this is a campaign which is also about thinking beyond the BBC, and our definition of public media is deliberately broad enough to include smaller independent media outlets, which are often the ones that most closely live out the ideals of acting in the public interest. This kind of independent media has flourished in the last 5 years, but often struggles to sustain itself, and our manifesto will include ideas for how to support these kinds of initiatives. If you have ideas that you think should be included in our manifesto for people's media, you can write them in the chat on whatever platform you're watching, and also contribute via the BBC and Beyond website. Tonight's event is about how we might be able to create the kind of media in Scotland that could actually serve all of the people of Scotland. In Scotland, as in the rest of the UK, the media is disproportionately created by people who are male, white, middle class, and able-bodied, and women and minoritised communities often face hostility when they try to participate. This isn't just about who tells the story, but also about which stories get told and how we can all be informed about the things we really need to know. We might not think we can expect any better from commercial media, but as I said, one of the key principles of public media and that underpins our public broadcasters is universality, that they need to serve everyone. Tonight's discussion will be about the things that need to change in Scotland, and I hope our speakers will explore questions such as how BBC Scotland could more fully reflect the diversity of the Scottish public, what an inclusive digital public sphere could look like, and some of the new participatory ways of producing media that could point the way for the future. I'm now going to introduce our great panel of speakers. Each of them is going to speak for around 5 minutes, and then we will come together for a discussion. If you'd like to ask a question, you can add it to the comment stream on the platform you're watching on, and we'll take as many as we can in the time that we have. Our speakers today are Talat Yacoub. Talat is a consultant, writer, and equalities campaigner. She is the founder of Pass the Mic, the directory of women of colour experts in Scotland, and project to improve the stories and cultures within Scottish media. She is also the co-founder of Women 50/50, the campaign for fair representation of women in politics. Then we have Tasneem Nazir. Tasneem is an award-winning journalist, author, and Universal Peace Federation Ambassador for Peace. Then we'll have Marcus Ryder. Marcus is the head of external consultancies at the Sir Lenny Henry Centre for Media Diversity. He was recently appointed the chair of RADA, the UK's leading drama academy. He was head of BBC Scotland Current Affairs for 8 years from 2007 to 2015. So some very significant years. And then we will have Karen Goodwin. Karen is a freelance journalist based in Glasgow and specialising in social issues. She is co-chair of the editorial committee at The Ferret and a former staffer at the Sunday Herald. She also runs workshops for those whose voices are often excluded from the media. Talat, would you like to kick off for us tonight?
Sure. Thank you so much, Debs, and thank you for all the organisation and all the work that's gone on behind this event as well. So I wanted to start off by telling you a little bit about Pass the Mic. Pass the Mic is, as Debs said, the first directory of women of colour experts across Scotland, and there's almost 200 women on it, and that includes professional expertise, lived experience. We have unpaid carers, we have campaigners across a range of issues, teachers, nurses, engineers, all different walks of life, all ready to participate in Scottish media. And this started in October 2019. And like most things in my life, this started after a lot of anger and rage. I've spent a significant amount of time doing work with media, alongside media, being interviewed, whether it's for newspapers, whether it is for broadcast media, whatever it might be. And often when I can't do it, or I don't feel I have the right expertise for it, I will recommend women of colour that I had on a private spreadsheet ready to share. And what I noticed was rarely were those women actually sought out when I recommended them. Rarely would there be a diverse range of women. And I found myself more and more being asked to discuss and be part of media panels and interviews where I wasn't the expertise, but they wanted some reference to some understanding of minoritised, racialised communities. What I found was a real laziness around who is asked to participate in media, going to those who people already know, already have networks with, and relying on that very small group who are known within media circles. As a consequence, I started Pass the Mic, which started off as just an online directory. It grew very quickly. You could tell that there was a lot of women of colour who were as frustrated as I was in their engagement with media and their experiences within it. And then we were very lucky to get some funding from the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. We were able to work alongside 30 women of colour and give them access to media networks and to be able to be paid for their writing in newspapers and be interviewed in media as well. We have 7 media partners across a range of different platforms, and it has gone well. But what it has illustrated is how surface level some of the diversity, inclusion and outreach efforts within Scottish media are. Often it is for a short period of time, a small injection of funds, a small injection of enthusiasm and motivation to do something about this. Perhaps 1 or 2 women of colour or people of colour will make their way through to participating in media, but they're often already the people with contacts, more people like me, rather than those people who have privileges, rather than those people whose voices are most marginalised or most ignored through mainstream media. What we've noticed is that there isn't the sustained long-term investment, both in outreach and in culture change within Scottish media, and that has multiple consequences. First of all, there is, of course, the issue of underrepresentation. We see this all of the time. Women of colour particularly are missing from those who make the news and those who participate in the news. But secondly, and as Deb's talked about, it's what is given oxygen, what stories are told. And often we find those stories that are about racial trauma, those stories that are about the intersections of racism and sexism, those stories that might matter most to communities of colour do not get the airtime they deserve and they need. The third thing that we see is an issue of false equivalence. So in the interest of balance, we have somebody on to talk about their own racial trauma, their experiences of racism, against somebody who doesn't believe that racism exists. That's not a majority view. That's not balanced. If anything, that's a skewed debate. And what that does is create trauma and re-traumatization, particularly for women of colour. And as a consequence, they retreat back from participating in media. So the questions are, how do we create a culture which fosters good, honest, fair debate without re-traumatizing, without harming, particularly women of colour and minoritised groups from coming forward and participating in media? And the best way we can do that is by having a media that works for people, having a media that is co-produced and co-owned by the public, and having a media where the majority of people feel able to hold it to account in a much more real way than what we're able to do right now. The Pass the Mic project has created a safe space for women of colour to come together and talk, and I've been hugely privileged to be able to have some of those conversations, be able to create that space where you're not explaining what the racism or sexism you're experiencing is. You have people who understand, have your back, and engage in those conversations with you in solidarity. And what has come across time and time again from the women who, almost 200 of them who are part of Pass the Mic, is how important that space is. So we've really got to think about how do we transfer that type of space, that type of security, safety, belief and trust into media, so that what is being produced is fit for purpose and what is being produced is trusted in by those minoritised, ignored and often harmed communities from the way in which we have done media so far. We've seen in COVID-19 the way images have been used, the way we have images largely of Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, hijab-wearing women have been used, even though they aren't part of the articles, particularly around COVID-19 and blame culture. We've seen a huge surge of people talking about racism being, playing the race card, or racism not being real. We've seen that with the UK report on pretending that institutionalized racism doesn't exist. And the way in which that was talked about told us a lot about how media either creates safety or creates harm. So we've really got to ask ourselves the question of how can media create a safer space and a fairer space for minoritized groups. From my perspective, what I would want to see is co-owned media and critically accountability in how media acts, who gets to participate in media, and also some public ownership about which stories are told and what stories are given oxygen. So that's just a few things from my perspective, and particularly who gets to tell the stories and what stories are given airtime is what matters to me the most.
I did the thing. I started muted. Someone always does it. So that was brilliant. Thank you so much, Talat. Now we'll hear from Tasneem. And you're also doing the thing. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Right. Hi, my name is Tasneem Nazir and I'm a freelance journalist based in Glasgow. I really do echo a lot of what Talat has said, and I'm really glad to be on this panel to talk about some of the lived experiences that I have and this change that we really want to see. So I really thank Debs as well for organising this. Now, I've worked for many mainstream media organisations in the UK and internationally, but sadly have found it particularly challenging in transitioning into broadcast in Scotland due to many different factors, which I'll come on to. Now, one of the fundamental problems that we see across the board in Scottish media is the lack of representation, both on screen and off screen. And I have long called for a media which is reflective of the national portrait of the society we live in, but paving the way for that has been extremely challenging. Throughout my time working as a journalist in Scotland, I've managed to break through the glass ceiling that I felt I was under for so long when STV News gave me a chance to do some freelance TV reports. It was the first time that I actually felt I was being judged on my potential and ability rather than the way I looked. But sadly, not all my experiences within Scottish media have been as positive. Someone I once networked with who was in the media in Scotland once told me that if I ever wanted to have a chance in broadcast, I would have to remove my hijab, which is my headscarf, and that I simply didn't have the right look with it on to go into broadcast. And sadly, I'm not the only one within the media landscape here in Scotland who has faced some sort of discrimination, racism, or lack of equal opportunities in comparison to their other white colleagues. The reason why I'm sharing this example is to give you all an insight into how much work is needed to be done in working towards real change in the media industry in Scotland. It is imperative that public broadcasters work on unconscious bias, give equal opportunities for those from diverse backgrounds who, like myself, already feel as though we have to work twice as hard to get ahead in this industry. There should be more opportunities to facilitate training and pathways for talent to skill up and be considered for roles that we want to pursue. And people in this industry should not have to fear backlash or abuse for speaking out. There just needs to be more accountability and open conversations to address some of the issues that I've raised today, as a lack of equal opportunities and discrimination that goes on behind the scenes, for example, can be really damaging. Without proper representation on screen and off, public broadcasters send out a message to people from diverse backgrounds like myself that certain spaces within this media industry in Scotland are not for you. And this can be extremely destructive because it can make people have a lack of confidence. You can feel that you're stuck in a rut and that you can just never excel within the industry, no matter how good you may be. And particularly for those looking up to people for role models and to see a reflection of themselves, whether it's on screen or back or off screen. If there's nobody like yourself reflected back, how can you ever aspire to be something that you can't see? Now, one of the ways that we can overcome these issues is for public broadcasters to go back and look at their diversity policies, look at who are the faces that are seen on our screens or within the news, who are the presenters, who are the newsreaders, who are the journalists bringing in stories, and who are the voices and contributors that we're seeing being played out on our screens. Do they actually represent only a portion of the wider society of Scotland and shut away voices, or are they reflective of the national portrait of Scotland? And to me, at the moment, I don't think we're there yet. We really need voices and perspectives that could bring value to the Scottish media landscape. We need more equal opportunities and monitoring on diversity policies when it comes to underrepresented and diverse candidates. In addition, there should be more investment in training and skills development so that people can feel that they can further excel within their careers in Scottish media, and definitely have accountability to the public broadcasters. Thank you. That's my take on it and my perspectives.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tasneem. And it was also great to hear from the small people in your household. And now we're going to hear from Marcus.
And I've unmuted. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to talk today and to be on this panel. I lived and worked in Scotland for 8 years, and I'm currently in Malaysia, and I've got a flight going back to Glasgow on the 20th of July. So I'll be returning to Scotland very soon. I think we need to remind ourselves why diversity is important in the media. And it's fundamentally a question of democracy, because it is fundamentally a question of freedom of speech. And you can't have freedom of speech if large sections of the population are excluded and are not given a platform to be able to tell their stories, to interpret the news around them, and to explain their reality as they see it. And what we have currently is a situation where large swathes of the population in Scotland and across the UK are excluded and not given equal access to the media and important media platforms. What's important to remember is that the television that you watch in Scotland is predominantly populated by people in Glasgow. That's where the media industry is concentrated, but through the Central Belt. But let's just look at Glasgow for a second. In the 2011 census, people of colour, predominantly Asian, but also Black people as well, made up roughly 4% of the population of Glasgow. Right? It's predicted that the demographic changes have been gigantic in Glasgow in the last 10 years. And it's predicted that in this census, 2021, the population of colour, the percentage of non-white people could be as high as 12% in Glasgow. And so what you're talking about is when you watch your television, considering that the vast majority of the people that you watch in Scotland are from the Central Belt, there is no way you're telling me that 12% of the population, 12% of the people you see on screen are non-white. I don't have the stats because I've got UK-wide stats, but I do know that the behind the camera, that staffing is not even close to 12%, right? And so what is the consequence of that? The consequence of that is the stories that we tell. It doesn't just affect the stories that we tell, it always affects the framing of those stories. So just today, we have the UN coming out with the fact that the UK suffers from systemic racism, and the UK police in particular suffers from systemic racism, right? And so invariably, when the BBC and other public service broadcasters take information from the police, they take it on face value. As Black and Asian people, we are aware that a large part of what the police tell us is tinged, or more than tinged, is influenced by systemic racism. And so we actually take the veracity of what the police say in a different context, right? And we place different values on it. So we have different values on the very same information sources, right? And this is not reflected in the way that we tell our stories. This is not reflected in the way that we report our news, right? And so because of our different values and our values, right, are sometimes portrayed as being subjective, whereas other people's values are portrayed as being objective. And yet, if you look at the UN report, things that people of color have been saying with regards to the police, with regards to the way society is structured, from a quote unquote objective source, the UN, right, our perspective seems to be correct, right? And so I think it's not just a case of telling our stories, it's trying to make sure that you can only have objective news, you can only have the most truthful news will be news which actually reflects the entire population. And right now, across Scotland and across the UK, we don't get that. And so we really need to fight harder to make sure that people of color and people and disabled people and women and people from all underrepresented groups, that I can no longer call these types of people underrepresented groups. We just need to they need to be represented fairly, because until we do that, we have a real problem. We have a real problem with our democracy and a real problem with freedom of speech. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Marcus, and really appreciate you joining us from Malaysia, where it is very late at night right now. Okay, finally, let's hear from Karen.
Hi, sorry, I did the mute thing as well, just at that last moment there. Thanks very much for having me, Debs. A little bit about me. I'm actually the co-editor of The Ferret.Scot, which is an investigations platform in Scotland. We're independent, we're owned by our members. And I suppose that's the perspective that I'm talking from today. As Deb said, you know, it's independent media that's sometimes trying to do things a little bit differently. My background is in newspapers. I've worked for newspapers for a long time. I worked at the Sunday Herald and the Big Issue when I first started, many years at the Sunday Times. I have freelanced for everyone from the Herald to BBC Online. So I've been in an awful lot of newsrooms, and so I absolutely echo Marcus when he talks about that lack of diversity and representation that you see right across Scottish media and still today. I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit about newspapers because that's where I come from, I suppose. UK media is still owned by, you know, very powerful corporations, and I think it's important to remember that. So most of them are headed up by the world's richest white men. Over 80% of newspapers are run by 4 companies: News Corp by Rupert Murdoch, DMG by Viscount Rothermere, Trinity Mirror produces is another big company producing a lot of some of the best-selling newspapers in Scotland. So you know, we are very much still being run by the establishment, I suppose, in a lot of large swathes of the media. Marcus will have better figures than this on me, but according to City University in 2016, almost all journalists across the UK are white. 94% working in the media were white. In 86% that research said were university educated, and 55% were men. They also found that women were much less likely to be promoted or paid as much as their male colleagues. And research from last year, which took July as a sample month, found not one single byline from a Black writer on the front page of a UK newspaper, which is really, given the stats that Marcus has just given about diversity in Glasgow and, you know, right across the UK, just really shocking. So the Ferret is not a newspaper, and we're a not-for-profit media co-op trying to do things differently, but I need to caveat everything I say from here by saying that the Ferret is absolutely not diverse enough in terms of its regular writers, and it's not doing enough to change that. And so one of the things that I'm hoping to take away from discussions today is a really solid personal commitment to put in place an action plan to help deal with that, because saying that it's not easy is no longer, I think, acceptable. So saying that, while we are not doing as well as we should on representation, I think we do also do something different in terms of the stories we tell. And part of that is some of the kind of things that Talat was talking about, in terms of the way that we are owned by our members. We're not for profit. There are no advertisers or head honchos to tell us what to write. My co-editor Billy Briggs and I are editors, but we also decide in co-production with our editorial committee. We have an ideas at the ferret.scot board, which everyone is welcome to use and bring forward ideas and tips. We follow up with as many of those as we possibly can. We try and pull diverse sort of scoping panels and types of research where we do focus groups ahead of big investigations. We ask our members to vote on what they would like us to investigate next. So we're trying to do things in a more democratic and representative way in terms of the stories that we tell and in terms of the way that we frame them too. So some of the other things that help us with that are time. So we're not like a newspaper. We don't fill slots. We don't have a number of page leads and splashes and things to get done in a week. We try and do a story or a fact check every day, and we do regular investigations monthly, fortnightly, weekly. But we have time to dig a little bit, and we have time to speak to lots of diverse people about how they see a subject and what we really need to know about it, so we can really get under the skin of it, I think. We also have the ability to treat our contributors and our co-producers with the respect that they deserve. So if somebody changes their mind about speaking out, we can just hold that story and find somebody else who feels comfortable while knowing that that person has helped to inform the story. We don't have any pressure to just go anyway. We don't have to write a particular headline for sales. And yes, we have targets. And yes, we want to increase our reach. But we have the luxury of making ethics matter more than the money, because we are not for profit. We're regulated by Impress, which is fully compliant with the recommendations of the Leveson Inquiry. And all of that, I hope, helps build trust. And so I know that when I write about migration, for example, that I have a really rich pool of people who I think do trust that we will try and tell their stories. I know that I'm far from unique in being a journalist who really values those grassroots contacts. But I do say that they are the most important for me in helping me understand the world around me, and helping me do my job. So that's the solution, I suppose, that the Ferret are trying to offer, to rebuild a media that's owned by people and staffed by accountable, skilled professionals. And it is not perfect, and we're learning as we go. We'd really like you to join us and help us learn that. theferret.scot/subscribe. But we think that really trying to tell stories with people in a more democratic, representative way is not only good for democracy, but just for the whole of Scottish society. So yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's bring everybody on and we can start thinking about some questions. So I guess the first question it would be good to address head on is, let's actually have a question about the BBC. Now, I understand that the BBC is a contentious topic everywhere, but I've understood from planning this event things that the BBC has there's a particular quality to the discussion around the BBC in Scotland. So I come to this question with that. But we've had a question asked we've had a comment made on one of the platforms saying that the BBC is London-centric British state broadcaster and not Scottish, and this is part of the problem. We've also had a question saying, is it possible to reform the BBC so it adequately reports on Scottish issues, or is it a lost cause? I think maybe I'm trying to invite you to give a response. You've all described the kind of changes that you think need to be made to make Scottish media more representative, more democratic, more inclusive. Which of those things do you think, in an ideal world, BBC Scotland should be doing or could be doing? For example, I'd love to hear from your experience, Karen, of trying to create kind of these forms of democratic participation. Could BBC Scotland be doing those? What could those look like? I might kick Marcus into doing this one first, because I think you've probably thought a lot about these questions.
Is BBC Scotland beyond help? Is that basically the question?
It's that could be what you answer. Or it could be the question you answer, or it could be saying, if the BBC was to do something to make it not beyond help, what would it do? What would that look like?
Okay, I think that if Scotland is part of the United Kingdom, there will be a national broadcaster, right? And right now, and that's the reality. And right now, that national broadcaster is the BBC, right? And so I think that there are issues that could be resolved if Scotland was independent. But if Scotland is part of the Union, there will be a national broadcaster. And if Scotland is independent, there will be a national broadcaster that will be Scottish. And so we need to see, how can a national broadcaster reflect not just the interests of where it is situated, but also of the entire country, right? And so if that is the challenge that we have, the only way that you can do that is by making sure that you decentralize your commissioning, that you decentralize your budgets, and you make sure that you give real editorial control to different parts of the country and to different communities within those parts of the country. Now, good examples of that is Germany. And so what Germany has is that its broadcasting and its national broadcaster is very decentralized throughout its states. But what you don't get is that, and the amount of tax that people pay for the national broadcaster is roughly the same. They pay it in a different way, but it's roughly the same as the license fee, right? And so what Germany doesn't have is, it doesn't have as powerful global media as the BBC. Deutsche Welle is not as well known globally and doesn't have the global influence of the BBC. Now, obviously, there are issues with regards to language, whether any German language media could actually do that, but it doesn't even come close, right? And so what we have to balance is how we actually ensure, do we want to have a broadcaster that is on a global stage? Not necessarily, and I think it would be very difficult to have a broadcaster on a global stage which also can look externally globally and be able to reflect internally all the different sections of the UK. So these are hard, difficult choices. The other choice that we have is that Karen listed all the global news organizations which are owned, forget the BBC, which are owned out by multi-millionaires, right? Because Scotland and the UK is for the most part, speaks English, right? It is very hard to guard against CNN and other multinational media organizations from coming in a way that they cannot threaten to the same degree France, Germany, non-Anglophone speaking countries. So how do we protect against that? And so what we have is a really difficult situation. So there's no easy answer, right? So the easy answer is like, we just decentralize. That's absolutely fine. But then making sure that we're able to, and I completely support increase decentralization and increased editorial power and spend in the different nations and regions and within communities. Absolutely. The challenge then is that once you've done that and you do decentralize, is what is the best way to fight against, I'm trying to not use emotive words like invasion, but but I will use emotive words, the invasion of your Anglophone multinationals who are incredibly powerful, right? And if you are a small decentralized broadcaster trying to fight against the might of CNN or New York Times, because a lot of us on this call are nice lefty, so let's talk about the nice lefty ones, The Guardian, New York Times, whoever, that's really difficult. And so it's a hard balancing act. And I definitely don't have, I was going to say, I don't have all of the answers. I don't even have some of the answers, right? But at least knowing what those questions are, knowing what those challenges are, hopefully we'll be able to figure it out. But recognize that we need to decentralize that power is the start. But then how we guard against the multinationals is the next challenge.
Yeah, I think that's a really clear explanation, and maybe it indicates that one of the solutions is that everybody just has to learn Gaelic and Welsh, and then we're not competing with anyone in English. Who would like to come in next with saying something about what we should do with the BBC in Scotland? Tasneem, would you like to?
Yeah, I really think in terms of reforming the BBC, it would be very challenging in a sense that it is a national broadcaster, and we do have our own Scottish BBC Scotland that predominantly focuses on Scotland-based stories, as does STV, which does a similar thing to ITV, but STV is obviously focused more on the Scottish news. So I think in terms of the BBC, it really needs to bring about this idea and what I've talked about before of equal opportunities. And in order that they do this, they really need to have a look at who is fronting, certain shows and who is participating in conversations and dialogue on the news. Because what's happening is they've got all these diversity policies, but we're not actually seeing any kind of real actionable change. And that's my own individual perspective of that, having been in the industry for so long. And whilst there have been opportunities for people from various different backgrounds perhaps to participate, when it comes to the hiring process, when it comes to actually attending interviews, there really needs to be a way of retaining talent, for example, instead of having perhaps a person just coming on to do a one-off gig at the BBC Scotland, and really focusing on actionable steps which can create that reform that is so needed at the moment. And I think that's pivotal if we're going to see any kind of change at the BBC, and really taking on opinions from the wider public, because I think that really helps to have some kind of survey and monitoring about what they are seeing on their TV screens and what they want to see and the kind of stories they'd like to see. And I think that's particularly important. I think we've lost Debbie.
We've lost Debs.
Right.
We've lost our chair.
Talat, you were going to make a point about your experience of the BBC.
Yeah, sure. So, one of the things that I think is really, really critical here is the space in which the conversation about BBC reform is happening. So the politicization of that space, where there's reform for, in my view, wrong reasons happening from the right, and legitimate reform being looked at from everywhere else, creates a real suffocation and a prevention of us being able to deliver the BBC and being fit for purpose and delivering the kind of BBC we're looking for. Because what you end up doing is having this very binary conversation, and almost find yourself in a position where you're trying to you're standing up for the BBC against what is a push to be able to control it even further. So I think the thing that could help the most in terms of BBC is to try and reinstate some kind of independence, some kind of strength, because it's closeness to and increasing closeness in terms of accountability, who is on the board, who is chair, who gets to make accountability decisions, from my perspective, leaning towards the right and leaning towards our current government. And that is really problematic, and that is what erodes trust in the BBC as well. So we need to have these conversations in a space where the conversation is legitimate rather than it being pulled into a really unhelpful territory that it's in right now, and a dangerous one for those of us who actually want to see some improvement within the BBC.
Yeah.
Seems like you managed to chair yourselves while I got kicked out of the stream. Yeah, Karen?
I would echo Talet's points there, but I thought it was really interesting what Marcus was saying about that decentralization and the importance of having your own editorial control and your budgets. And I suppose what sometimes in the kind of looking into the BBC, and I'm very much looking in, I don't know, the content that they're producing can be excellent. You know, they can really do, and under Marcus did some great investigations, and that can be really strong. But it feels like sometimes, why is there not more? You know, and I suppose part of that is about money, and part of that is about a sort of an over bureaucracy, I suppose, that you could perceive. And Marcus, you'll know more than me about that kind of, I think, can be demotivating for some people that have been there for a long time to keep being kind of fresh in their world and really reflecting what Scotland is and is becoming. And that constant learning and changing and shifting that you have to do as a journalist can be quite difficult when you don't feel empowered, right? And so I think it's about empowering the people that work there to really go out there and report, because it's fundamentally essential.
Thank you all so much for those responses. I think one of the conversations that Talat and I were having when we were planning this event was we were thinking about kind of feminist media and public media as feminist media. And I think that, you know, the things that you started off with, Talat, talking about how participating in media as people from minoritized communities, as people who are underrepresented, can be traumatic. And then the need to create like spaces and practices of care. And I wondered what examples any of you had experienced of something that you would call like a kind of feminist media practice that maybe could be some of the fundamentals of public media more generally.
So I know that this is an area that Talet's got really great ideas on, so sorry to jump in. But I suppose the thing that I'm thinking about is, because I think this is such an interesting point about media being a traditional male hierarchical system. And so, for example, the fact that the Ferret is non-hierarchical is seen as a really radical thing, when in fact it's really not. It's just a group of people making joint decisions that are strengthened by the fact that there's a hive mind involved. And the types of ways that I've seen it work really well on a kind of larger scale are through the Bureau of Investigative Journalists, who have been doing quite a lot of really interesting co-production in some of their big investigations, where they do things like starting with a story circle, where they involve people with lived experience to sit together and to talk about what their experience is, to help to frame the story from the very start, to have allies and experts who are in the room at the same time, and to really start building that investigation from the grassroots up. And then as they develop, you know, whether that's working with people who've experienced homelessness or whether it's delivery drivers on 0 hours contracts, you know, continuing to look for their input and expertise, using their stories as part of the whole package, and then working with the mainstream broadcasters like Channel 4 News, like The Mirror, to really, as well as with journalists right across the country, to co-publish on the same day and give it massive reach and impact. So I think that for me is a way in which you can do things differently and still have that same public interest impact that you're looking for.
I think one of the things that I've noticed when, years of working on feminist and anti-racist causes and issues, and it's those who are the most understanding of that space, understanding of trauma, are the women journalists or the journalists of colour, right? Because they've experienced that themselves. So what ends up happening is that there is an additional emotional burden on those journalists who then understand that and want to have a bit more care, a bit more nuance in what it is that they are putting together for media. But then the issue, of course, becomes they don't have editorial control. They're not the ones that are editing it. They're not the ones that are making the headlines. They're not the ones that are communicating it on different platforms. So when I'm talking about, for example, trying to push, a feminist topic, perhaps something that is significant, requires nuance, particularly around violence against women, for example, there are a number of women journalists who I can trust with that, but it relies on their emotional labor. And I know there's other people that I can't go to. So that small representation is doing a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of work. And a lot of that comes back to what Marcus was talking about, which is who owns it, and the issue of following the money. So how often is part of the issue the clickbait nature of what we do to headlines, of what stories get published, how things are then put on social media. It's all about how many clicks you get. It's all about how newsworthy and share-worthy that is. And that's the space where nuance goes. And that's a space where trauma becomes a selling point. So whilst we have spaces of media which are about how many clicks you can get, which are about a small group of privileged people making editorial decisions, and it following the money rather than following the story and the majority of people, then you can't have a feminist or anti-racist media. And so I think what it comes down to is who is investing, how is that invested in, and who is around the decision-making table. And all of those things are linked.
Yeah, and I think that really links with what Karen was saying as well about the time frame, and how part of that thing around the clickbait and is also about how quickly can you put something out, which completely conflicts in many cases with accuracy, with nuance, with fair representation. Tasneem or Marcus, do you want to talk about your ideas about how your experiences, if you've had any, of a kind of feminist media practice?
Well, I've had many experiences, not only being a journalist, a woman of colour, as a visibly Muslim woman as well, where I'm often in a situation where I'm often asked to report on stories perhaps on race, on issues to do with race, or something to do with my religion and identity. And there's been many organisations in Scotland who've been great and said, delve into other topics as well. And I really appreciate that. But specifically with public broadcasters, I say there's only really two main public broadcasters in Scotland, which is the BBC Scotland and STV. And I think having maybe other media outlets located within Scotland itself would really help in terms of coverage and getting more representation and more people to cover stories, such as violence against women, perhaps, or issues to do with race and diversity. But it's often the case that I found, as it's my lived experience, that it's often we get put into a kind of pigeonhole with other, and it would be really good to see public broadcasters calling us in to perhaps talk about parenting. As you may have heard, my children in the background, which I'm trying to keep at bay at the moment, and things like that make us more humanizes our lived experiences and our shared experiences as people within the society. And it's not always just about things to do with identity. And I think that's really something that we've got to crack on with. And it comes back to having a people-owned media and having them more involved in what is the news and what goes on our screens.
Marcus?
I think it's a really interesting question, which isn't asked enough with regards to what is a feminist media. And when you ask my experience of a feminist media is, I would say, is limited, if non-existent. And part of that, and what's interesting about that is until I worked in Scotland, I worked in television and I've worked in the media now for almost 30 years. And part of that has been in China, part's been in Malaysia, London, Manchester, Scotland. And with the exception of Scotland, I have exclusively had women bosses, right? Head of news of the BBC for most of the time when, not BBC Scotland, but for most of the time I was in Scotland, the head of BBC News was a woman. And also the head of BBC News right now is a woman, right? And so I think what's interesting for me to reflect on is that this shows that having women in important editorial, the most important editorial positions does not feminist media create, right? And it goes back to what Karen was saying, is that we actually have to look at the way that the organizations are structured, whether they're hierarchical, how the decision-making process is made, and whether we're just talking about figureheads or how power is disseminated and throughout an organization and the gender and different makeup of those people, not just gender, but other issues of intersectionality, right? And I think that's really important to remember, because if we don't, invariably when we talk about diversity, it quickly becomes just a headcount issue of what's the percentage of Black people, what's the percentage of women, what's the percentage of whatever. And from my experience, and so I'm loving that question. I'm gonna think about it a lot after this, but it's got me thinking that it is proof that it's not just about headcount. It's about so much more. Because if it was just about headcount, the BBC would be a feminist media organization, and nobody thinks the BBC is a feminist media organization. All right, so thank you so much for asking that question, and it will get me thinking as to why have I not been working in a feminist media organization.
I think it is really interesting, Debs, and you only need to look at the Home Office to understand some of the problems around representation not being the end of the answer, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I just wanted to say, so we had a comment which really reflected what you were saying, Tasneem. So one saying, STV and BBC Scotland are a duopoly, and we need independent broadcasters owned and operated from Scotland, not British relay channels with some opt-ins. So that would be, I suppose these are also some of the things of, there is this possibility of Scottish independence and the possibility that Scotland might be able to, as it happens, media policy is actually a devolved issue, as I understand it, but has never really been taken up by the Scottish government. But yeah, it'd be interesting to know what kind of conversations are happening about what could be possible in an independent Scotland. But yeah, I think also this thing that you were saying, Marcus, of, diversity is not just about a head count or, the transformation that's needed, also reflects some of the questions and comments we've had. So one was saying, Glasgow is just one part of Scotland. What about Gaelic and the Highlands? Someone saying about how those who live in the Scottish border get ITV border instead of STV, and asking how you feel about their representation. And I suppose maybe there's a kind of a question that encompasses those, which are, what are some of the specific elements within kind of representing Scotland that are really, what are some of the fault lines that are really important to take into account? We obviously, you've talked about the growth of the population of colour in Scotland, the underrepresentation of that. obviously women, but there are always these kind of specific forms of underrepresentation which occur in a specific context. And I wonder, where you see those fault lines happening in a sort of specifically Scottish way, if that makes sense. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I think Marcus mentioned it beforehand. I think one of the things that we're very aware of is the central belt focus within Scotland. So having that, when we're looking at media and not really thinking about rural Scotland, not thinking about the Highlands, and not investing in Scots language, for example, and having media available in that language, having more of our journalists and more presenting news from rural Scotland is becoming really evident. And I think it's pretty fair that people who are from those areas get agitated and frustrated at them not being represented and it being so central belt focused. So I think that's very fair. And I think that's very fair, and I think that's something that we need to invest in better, and I think we need to engage in more as well. There's always going to be the constitutional fault line. There's always going to be the issue of constitution and how that is discussed, debated, and often BBC is right in the middle of that. It's either loved or loathed, depending on where you're sitting in that constitutional debate. But what's really important is to make sure that any discussion is done fairly, is representative display of Scotland, and that it actually, what I'd really desperately need, and it's something that I need, and not just something that I would like to have, but it's required, is nuance to return to media, for it to be a space where deliberation can happen, where fact and expertise are valued, as opposed to how much of our uproar you can create on social media or Twitter. A space of facts, a space of trust, and a space of tackling false equivalence is really has to be central to any media platform.
Anyone else want to come in? I would also say we had a comment early on as well, someone saying, is the issue about sex or colour of skin or about social class? And obviously shifting the terrain to social class is something that often happens. But I wonder about if any of you wanted to say anything about the class makeup of Scottish media as well. I assume it's similar to elsewhere in the UK.
Yeah, well, I mean, class was, I guess, the thing that I was going to come in with, just because I do quite a lot of reporting around groups that I suppose are marginalised. I edited a very grassroots magazine called The Pavement a few years back, which is for homeless readership, distributed in largely London, but in cities around the UK, really, and did media workshops with people who had experienced homelessness in a day centre in Glasgow. And I tell you what, their lived experience is hardly reflected on BBC or STV. But they do read the Digger and they read the Daily Record. But there's just not even an attempt to kind of reflect properly, a wide range of experiences when it comes to class. And, Darren McGarvey's recent BBC series, which was excellent, really sort of shone a light on how alive and well the class system is in Scotland, and how under-discussed it is as well. And like Talat, I want to see that discussed with nuance. I want to see that talked about in terms of what happens when you have migration and you talk about integration into a working class area. What happens there, and why are we surprised when it's the middle class people who are not, having to really grapple with the everyday there, that see that as something they can kind of look down on the difficulties around that. Why are we not talking about really what that is to the housing situation? Because if you aren't from those communities, you aren't living in that, it seems like less important, and it comes back to those things around representation and about framing and about just a lot of journalists not really understanding, I think, a lot of what's going on out with their own experience. So for me, how do we get journalists to just live a bit more? How do we get them away from their computers? When I started as a young journalist, in Sunday newspapers, if you were sitting at a desk on a Tuesday or Wednesday, what the hell were you doing here? Get out there, because what will you learn in front of a computer? And that's very different for young journalists today. So I think we really need to think about the experience that we're giving young journalists. And rather than just always saying, journalists need to do better, media needs to do better, like, okay, yes, they do, but how can we support them to do that? What are the barriers? And, that's about the ownership and the clicks and the profit and the how do we find a way of really putting value back on proper insightful reporting, where people look in depth at experiences that are out with their own and report on those.
I do think that it's really important when we talk about class that we don't talk about it separately from race and gender, and somebody doesn't get to pick whether the issue that they're experiencing is classism, sexism, or racism. It's all those things at the same time. So, the comment there talked about, we need to look at class, not sex or gender. I don't get to pick that. I don't get to go into a room when I'm being interviewed or I'm part of the media. I don't get to go, well, I wonder which bit of me it is that they're going to be bigoted towards. Because you can be working class, a woman, and black or brown. These things are not separate. And so it's not about a hierarchy of oppression. It's not about, only think about one thing. It's about understanding the complexity of people's lives, and that multiple discriminations, multiple oppressions are happening at the same time. And if you pick only one of those to deal with, then what will happen is you leave those who are most marginalized at the back of the queue the way they always are. You will deal with the lowest hanging fruit. So if we want to talk about class, then we'll talk about those people who had access to some education, who are white and are not migrants, and whose English is their first language. And maybe we'll make things better for them. But what if we talked about working class communities, including those who are migrants, including those who are single parents, including those who are unpaid carers? If we did it like that, we'd pick up everybody along the way. So I think it's really important we don't silo out our equalities issues and think that sex, gender, and race doesn't have a place in this. It does, because we're all interwoven in these discriminations.
I would just echo that as well, is that the other aspect is to make sure that we don't use look at everything through a reductionist prism. The millennia issues of sexism and women in society, right? That's not going to be solved just by looking with regards to one type of class analysis. Similarly, class issues are not going to be solved miraculously just by looking through one type of analysis. And the history that I have as a Black person, and the absolute Holocaust of slavery is not solved just by looking at it through a class prism or through a feminist prism. And so we need to ensure that we not only recognize these different issues, but also recognize that we need to have different tools which will be appropriate at different times to analyze them and to find the right solutions. Because I find that sometimes there can be a reductionist element as to how we want to categorize our problems, how we want to view our problems, and how we want to solve them. And I normally find that we actually need a multiplicity of approaches in all of those three things. One thing that I really want to quickly say is that I'm looking at the panel, and myself included, and we've been talking about journalism a lot, but I think it's really important to also look at drama. I think it's really important to look at all other forms of media as well. There's a reason why that during the McCarthy era, they clamped down and they had a witch hunt on script writers and drama directors, because the way we view the world is often through narratives, and these narratives are formed through drama. They're invariably not actually formed through news and current affairs. And so if we want to understand our world better, we should not think that the only way we do it is through journalism. We need to look at the stories that we tell through all different genres as well. I've got a 5-year-old son. Tasneem was just talking about her children. So we do also need to look at the diversity of children's programs and all different, even quiz shows, different ways in which we consume knowledge and create our narratives, rather than just, and there's a natural tendency when I've been on these panels to constantly talk about journalism. And as I said, I'm a journalist, so it's only, so I'm as guilty as anybody, but we also need to look at other genres as well.
Tasneem, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I totally echo what Marcus has said there, actually, that we should really see representation across the board, extending to film and TV, not just confined to journalism. I think it's really important because any audience is often looking to see a reflection on themselves, whether it's through acting. We've seen it when we've had movies, such as Black Panther, for example, where we're really looking at representation and seeing whether we can really see a reflection of ourselves or what we can aspire to be like. And I think that's really, really important. Now, my son, for example, always talks about wanting to become an actor, so it's probably, a different creative route. And we kind of encourage, their pursuits. And the only way we can do that is by also giving them something to aspire to be like, or they might take role models, for example, within the media. But if there's nobody like them, or nobody who they can really relate to, or think, he looks like me, or that person's got, some kind of personality that's like me, and it's just something that they can really aspire to be like, that can be really damaging if they're not seeing that on screen. And I think it's important across the board, not only in journalism, but in film and in TV and all the other creative industries. I also want to, sorry, I just coming back to the other point very quickly, is that there's also trust issues. Again, I'm sorry, going back to journalism, but there's also, I've had lived experiences of trust issues with contributors, with public broadcasters not being able to have a contributor on because they don't want to give their opinion. For example, I was doing a report on the dire conditions that refugees were facing, and they only wanted to trust me with their story. They didn't want to go and talk to, there was another public broadcaster journalist there, and they didn't want to talk to that particular person because they said that some of the words they've given to them have been misconstrued in the past. So things like this happen, and we have to be really careful. This is why it's so important to have representation across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think we are coming to the very end of this event. Thank you so much. I think this has been such a great conversation. I just wanted to close by asking each of you. So we're going to be writing this manifesto for a people's media over the summer, and I just wanted, your top headline, one thing, or 2 things if you must, that you would put in this manifesto. And that can be either thinking about how you think public broadcasters that we have should be transformed, or about how you think that other media should be supported. Anyone want to kick off?
Sure. So I'm gonna pick 2 things. Sorry, Des. One is for public broadcasters. From my perspective, we have to get in place significantly more robust, competent public accountability measures. There is not really a competent way to be able to hold media to account. There's not a real way to have a stake in the decisions that are being made and a scrutiny. And that has to be changed, that has to be overhauled if we're going to make any kind of difference and going to create public trust in public media. So one, accountability measures that are competent, that are accessible, that genuinely create consequence and scrutiny. And the second is we need investment in people's stories. So we need a way for there to be amplifying of local communities and them having control over the stories that are told and how their stories are told. So investment in kind of community-based stories and supporting them, engaging them in trusted media to be able to amplify what's going on in their local communities and having their stories heard. 2 critical things, I think, for the future of media in Scotland.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Absolutely. Who wants to go next? Marcus?
Kind of echoing a little bit. I think we need decentralization of regulation. Too much of the regulation, whether that's Ofcom or, God forbid, Karen, if we talk about Impress, they're based down in London. I think we need to look at ways in which we can decentralize the regulation of our media so that they are more aware and conversant of the different issues that are facing different communities in different parts of the UK. That's it.
Tasneem or Karen, you want to come in?
Go for it, Tasneem.
Well, I was just going to echo what Marcus and Talat has said as well, but I also think there needs to be real investment into looking into equal opportunities for all. I also think there needs to be investment in training and upskilling for those candidates who come into any of the creative industries in Scotland, to really give them the same opportunities as everybody.
And mine is a little bit less like it probably, it's not going to fit with the nice bullet points that Talat gave you. She's so good at that. But I guess what my kind of, in terms of a manifesto and a call to arms and a call to change, is really to find a way for journalists to admit that they can be wrong. Because I think that as a journalist, you're constantly scared of being wrong. There can be serious consequences for it. You can be sued, and it can sometimes make people ironically unable to listen and be challenged in their profession. And I think that we need to create a space where journalists can stop thinking they know what journalism is and listen to outsiders and find ways of telling those news stories in genuinely co-production, and just accepting that other people might know more than you. I suppose that's what my rambling point is for your manifesto.
But basically, a media where there's just a level of care, both in the things that you're writing, but also in the forms of accountability, where accountability doesn't just mean, like you're going to be cancelled forever, but there's actually some possibility of reparation of harm, and then the possibility of doing better. Yeah,
the possibility of doing better.
Okay, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much to everyone, for all of our speakers. Thank you to everyone for watching. If you want updates on the campaign, you can sign up to our newsletter on bbcandbeyond.net. And if you'd like to contribute to the manifesto, you can also use the form on the website there. Thank you so much and good night.